You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. Our Revolution Roundtable was joined this month by Sheilah Vance, author of Threshold to Valley Forge, The 6 Days of the Gulf Mills Encampment. Ms. Vance joined our roundtable on Zoom. All right, welcome everybody tonight to the American Revolution Roundtable. We're joined tonight by our special guest, Sheilah Vance, who is the author of Threshold to Valley Forge, which covers a rather brief period, about a week or a little more than a week before Washington's army settled into Valley Forge. We're going to be focusing on that particular moment in time and all the things that went on during that period. Sheilah, welcome to the American Revolution Roundtable.
Thank you, Michael. Happy to be here.
Well, let's start off. This is, as I say, a fairly brief period that's not much written about in the Revolution. Why did you decide to tackle this topic?
Well, yes, I grew up in Gulf Mills, so you can't live really anywhere in the Philadelphia area and not have some relationship to the Revolutionary War, like not have somewhere you lived, have some relationship to the Revolutionary War. So I grew up in Gulf Mills on Rebel Hill Road. Rebel Hill is the highest point in Gulf Mills, Upper Marion Township, and it's about west of Philadelphia. When I was growing up, there's a big rock that hangs over the street of Old Gulf Road on the way to Valley Forge. It's called the Hanging Rock. And as I was growing up, the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation was constantly trying to shade back the Hanging Rock because there were a lot of accidents there. And the communities rallied and said, look, don't do that because it's very historic, that George Washington and his army marched past the Hanging Rock on their way to Valley Forge. And my mother told me that the only reason Washington went to Valley Forge is because Rebel Hill, Gulf Mills, basically was too close to Philadelphia at about 17 miles, maybe 20 miles, depending wherever you are, from Philadelphia. And so then they moved further west to Valley Forge. So that's how I came to be interested in it. And then I just came to be interested in the history. And as I was growing up, there was like woods across the street from our house. We were there a lot. We found things like buckshot and all kinds of artifacts in the woods. So I just developed a real interest in history. And this Gulf Mills encampment was, like you said, was very much overlooked when I first started writing in this area in 2011, actually. And I was researching a novel called Becoming Valley Forge, which was all about the Philadelphia campaign, what happens when the war comes to your backyard. And I was just coming across all this information I never knew about the Gulf Mills encampment, which was essentially December 12th to 19th, right before the Army marched to Valley Forge. And I'm like, wait a minute, I was a good student in school at Upper Marion High School, and I never learned about half of these things. And so I just started digging, and decided that I wanted to write a full-length nonfiction book about the Gulf Mills encampment. And there was there's a monument to the encampment, to the soldiers, that was dedicated in like the late 1890s. It was sponsored by the Pennsylvania Sons of the Revolution. At that dedication ceremony, the speaker called it the area, the threshold to Valley Forge. So that's where the name comes from.
Just to set the scene a little bit more for everybody else, Gulf Mills, as you said, is a few miles northwest of Philadelphia. The encampment took place in December of 1777. This was after the Philadelphia campaign, where General Howe had come up through Maryland and Delaware and fought the Battle of Brandywine, which Washington lost, and then slipped past Washington on the Schuylkill River to get into Philadelphia. And then Washington counterattacked at Germantown and lost that battle as well. So it was kind of a low point for the Continental Army. Your book begins with the Battle of White Marsh. Why don't you just describe that for us a little bit?
Okay, so with my book, I wanted to just set the stage for what the Continental Army was facing at that time, really what the new United States was facing at that time, because none of these encampments really took place in a vacuum. It's not like the soldiers were just at a place and that was it, and that they had no contact with the outside world. They did. There was a lot of correspondence going back and forth between the Army, between the Continental Congress, at least in Pennsylvania, and the Pennsylvania General Assembly, and then the people. There was a lot of interaction. So I wanted to set the stage because the Continental Army and the new United States really were looking for a way forward. I wanted to start with the White Marsh encampment, which, as you said, occurred right after the Battle of Germantown, was in early October, October 4th or 5th, around there. And after that, Washington and his army spent 6 weeks in White Marsh, which is, again, further away from Philadelphia than Germantown, where that battle was. And White Marsh was right across the Schuylkill River from Gulf Mills. The White Marsh encampment was very important because there were a lot of questions about Washington's leadership ability. General Gates had just been victorious in the Battle of Saratoga. And as you said, Michael, Washington didn't have many victories during the Philadelphia campaign. So people were questioning his leadership, even to the extent that the Continental Congress sent a camp committee of 3 members of the Continental Congress to Washington's encampment in White Marsh to just question him, like, what are you doing? Like, what's your plans for the winter? Are you going to go into winter quarters, and when, and where are you going? And so it just so happened that while it was called the Continental Congress Camp Committee, while they were there, General Howe decided to move 10,000 of his troops out of Philadelphia and really planned to attack Washington one last time before Howe was going into winter quarters. The British had occupied Philadelphia on September 26th. They marched in with no shots fired. They were going to have their winter quarters in Philadelphia. But Howe decided to march his army out to see if he could engage with Washington one more time. And Washington had the whole Continental Army on the ready. They were ready for a major engagement. But the major engagement never happened. There were skirmishes and engagements around the edges between both armies, but the Battle of White Marsh was something that really, after about 2 days when Washington was ready and the armies were kind of playing with each other and attack, advancing, and then they would retreat, Howe decided to totally retreat back to Philadelphia and go into winter quarters. I thought it was important to talk about that just because, it was an important part of the Philadelphia campaign. But that's when Washington decided, look, I've really got to put some distance between Philadelphia, where the British were, and our army. So he really decided he had to cross the Schuylkill River, put the Schuylkill River, which is one of the main rivers in the Philadelphia area, between the British and Philadelphia and his army. So he decided that he was going to have his army cross at a place called Matson's Ford and come over. As soon as you cross Matson's Ford from White Marsh, you are in Gulf Mills. So that's why I started with the Battle of White Marsh, to just give a sense of what was going on at the time. And in my book, I kind of approached it, as I said, Michael, I went to Howard University in Washington here. I was a journalism major. So I consider myself a journalist historian. Our training was to, of course, do the research, let the people tell the story in their own words. I have a lot of original documents. I did a lot of research. I have a lot of original documents letting the people tell the story of what happened in their own words. But we were also trained to put it in context. So that's kind of how I approached the book. So that's why I started with White Marsh, basically, like before we got to Gulf Mills, or before the Continental Army got to Gulf Mills, what was going on? Like, what was on Washington's mind? What was on the mind of the Continental Congress, which left Philadelphia when the British, let's say, took over Philadelphia, which was the capital of the United States. And so they left Philadelphia and went to Lancaster. I keep getting them confused. And then the Pennsylvania General Assembly, which also met in Philadelphia at what is now Independence Hall, left and went to York. So Lancaster was about 100 miles away. York was about 80 miles away from Philadelphia. So a lot was going on. the Continental Congress was concerned, what are we going to do with this army that's going to be in our backyards for the winter? And they're going to be, how are we going to support them? Because, they were still trying to get the country together and they didn't have a lot of money and nor resources. And then the Pennsylvania General Assembly was like, well, don't look at us because, you're here in Pennsylvania, but we can't support this entire Continental Army. We can help, but we can only do so much. And plus, we have our people, our citizens here in Pennsylvania that we have to be concerned about. So there were a lot of things going on. And even at the same time, Pennsylvania's most famous citizen, Ben Franklin, well, actually, the United States' most famous citizen, Ben Franklin, was over in France. He was sent over to France by the Continental Congress to work with the French and try to get the French to come in and support the new United States in this battle against the British. So I just looked at all of this, like what happened during these 6 days in December. That's what I really wanted the publisher to call the book, but they decided on Threshold of Valley Forge. But so I looked at everything going on as much as I could find in these 6 days to give the reader the context, to put everything in context.
As you say, the Battle of White Marsh essentially didn't happen, at least in a big way, but it put Washington on notice that he was kind of at risk because he was so close to Philadelphia and he didn't have a river between himself and the enemy. And I guess one of the reasons they ended up not attacking was because the Continentals were alerted by some effective spies who got the word out to them that the British might be attacking them. And he obviously couldn't count on that happening every time. So, yeah, he crosses the Schuylkill River to put a big river between him. For people who are unfamiliar with the region, I guess Philadelphia today is bounded by the Delaware River on the east and the Schuylkill River on the west. At the time, Philadelphia, the city, was much smaller, so you were, quite a distance from the Philadelphia city limits, I guess, when you were out by the Schuylkill, especially this far north upriver. But yeah, Washington was retreating again after having retreated throughout the entire Philadelphia campaign. And we have to remember at the same time in late 1777 that another general, Horatio Gates, had just won an amazing victory at Saratoga. So a lot of politicians and other folks were kind of asking themselves, do we have the right person in charge of the Continental Army? Do this one guy who keeps losing battles versus the other guy who won this wonderful victory? And of course, that brought up the Conway Cabal. This was kind of early on in the Conway Cabal. What was happening at this period with that?
Well, again, Gates, it was like amazing for Gates to win at Saratoga. He captured, I'm trying to get the exact number of soldiers he captured. Maybe it was as many as 5,000 soldiers that he captured at Saratoga. And some of the other generals and members of the Continental Congress felt like Gates should be in charge of the Continental Army, not George Washington. So there were people in this cabal. Conway, I can't remember his exact rank, whether he was a general. I don't believe he was.
Conway he was a brigadier general for a long time, and he was bucking for a promotion to major general.
Okay.
And Washington,
yes, okay. All right.
Washington refused him that promotion, which caused him to get all upset and become an anti-Washington guy and kind of join Camp Gates.
Yes. So several other generals and politicians contrived to get Conway in charge of the Continental Army instead of George Washington. But that also was leaked to Washington, who fought it, and he had his supporters fight it. And ultimately, Conway was I supported you, Washington, and he didn't know that Washington had some correspondence from Conway that he was anti-Washington. But anyway, Conway did go on to become he was appointed the first inspector general of the Army. His supporters still got him a pretty important position, and Conway still had some sway over what Washington could do, which did not make Washington very happy, but that's what happened. And I do want to correct one thing I said. The Continental Congress went to York, Pennsylvania, which was about 100 miles west of Philadelphia. And the General Assembly of Pennsylvania went to Lancaster, which is about 80 miles west of Pennsylvania. So I kind of had it turned around.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, the Congress went to Lancaster at first, but then they found it too crowded there and moved on to York after a day or two. So Yeah, the Conway cabal was ongoing during this time. So while Washington was trying to decide what to do with his army, he was also kind of fighting for his political life with the Congress. And I think the cabal, we think of a cabal as kind of this sinister conspiracy. I don't think most of the people who are designated as members of the cabal today would characterize it in that way. It was more a question of, what the politicians would say. I'm just asking questions here. What we need to think about this a little bit. I'm not necessarily married to the idea of moving Washington on, but we have to start, thinking about it and asking questions. And one reason they actually appointed Conway to be the inspector general was kind of a dig at Washington because he was such an opponent. And a lot of members of Congress thought that's a good thing. You want an inspector general who's really going to challenge the commander and really, not just whitewash everything the commander does. So yeah, that was one of the reasons that Conway got where he got. And the cabal was people who were in the Gates camp were not necessarily all bad guys. John Adams, I think, was one of the people who was
Hmm.
at least on the fence about willing to consider replacing Washington, and other people, well-known people like Patrick Henry were as well. This is not just
Yeah.
a group of unknown men in the dark shadows. So yeah, Washington was fighting about all that at the same time that he was trying to figure out what to do with his army. Uh,
Right. So much was up in the air for, like I said, for the Continental Congress and for the country. They were all trying to figure out what to do. Like who had ever created a country before? So they were trying to figure out what to do, how to get all these pieces working together, and who were the right people to lead them to where they want to go.
Hey, Sheila, if I could interject a question, going back to White Marsh. This is Steve Goldhahn. I'm a South Jersey native. Well, actually a Philadelphia native, but I'm transplanted to South Jersey. Could you comment on the regarding the alerting the Washington's troops at White Marsh, the story that you hear about Lydia Dara?
Mhm.
What what kind of truth can be attributed to that? I think
Yes.
where she overheard the plans discussed by Major Andre and how the in night of early December 2nd, I think it was. But is I know the story was recounted later, years later, by her daughter Anne, and I don't know that there's much else in the way of historical record that would support that.
Well, I do write about that in the book.
Oh,
Um,
good.
my book, yes, it is true. Again, like I said, I did a lot of research and original documentation. So the
Hmm.
story is that Lydia Dara, was a woman who lived in Center City, Philadelphia, where the British were.
Right.
And she had either rented or the British had commandeered her home and were meeting there. And I don't know if it was General Andre, I think it was Hal himself who was meeting at her home, and they were talking about attacking Washington at White Marsh. And so Dara was friends with one of Washington's key advisors. Oh, his name is Elias Boudinot. So she was friends with him, and she managed to get a message to Boudinot that she overheard, the British general talking about going and attacking Washington. And she put the message in a needle case, like a cloth needle case that had needles in it. But she wrote something out and put it in that case and gave it to Boudinot. When Boudinot opened it up, he saw this message from her. So about the attack. So he took the case and alerted Washington, took it to Washington. So Washington, that's how Washington knew that the British were planning an attack at White Marsh. So there is truth to
There's
that story.
truth to
Yeah.
that. Okay.
Yeah. So it's in the book
Oh, okay. I'll have to
with the
check it out.
documentation. Uh-huh.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
yeah, that was a lucky break for the Continentals. And yeah, I think
Was.
Elias Boudinot, he went on to he did a lot of negotiating the release of American prisoners in New York and stuff like that. So yeah, he's a pretty active guy.
Very active. Yes, he was. Yes.
So yeah, anyway, the Americans are pulling back from White Marsh to Gulf Mills. We have what's known as the Battle of Matson's Ford. The Matson's Ford is literally a ford in the river where it was easier to cross than other places on the Schuylkill River, which is a pretty substantial river. It's not just a stream. I guess they came across a large, it was almost an accidental battle. They came across a large foraging party led by General Cornwallis, right? Is that
Correct.
what
So
happened?
that day, it was December 11th that Washington said, okay, Army, we're on the move. We're going to cross over the Schuylkill and we're going to cross at Matson's Ford. That was their plan. So Washington had sent an advance party, General Potter, who was in charge of the Pennsylvania militia. He sent, it was a very chaotic day. He sent Potter down closer to Philadelphia to do some advance work and kind of, again, let them know if they saw any British coming out of Philadelphia. But at the same time, General Smallwood was leading the first group of troops that were crossing over Matson's Ford. So they had built a little bridge because they had to get the carriages and things over, not just the people who could have walked over the ford part of the Matson's Ford, but they built a bridge with wood, whatever they could find, really, wood, carriages, pieces of somebody's fence or whatever. It was rickety. So they built something, but they were able to get 800 soldiers across. But they didn't know at the same time, closer to Philadelphia, Potter's forces saw a few thousand British coming out of Philadelphia, and they didn't know, well, are they coming to attack us? Are they coming to attack us one more time before we go into winter quarters? Is this another like a Battle of White Marsh situation? General Howe coming out. So Potter had his men stationed at 3 different buildings along the main road from Philadelphia out to the Matson's Ford. So he told his men, and they would ride down the road and alert the other group that was closer to Matson's Ford. Look, they're coming down. The British are coming down this way. And so they tried to raise a defense against the British, but Potter probably had, I don't know, 300, 400, 500 men, 600 maybe at the most. And here's several thousand, a couple thousand, really 2,000 to 3,000 British coming in their direction. So they just kept retreating back over a series of hills closer to the Matson's Ford. At the same time that was happening with Potter at one end, and again, this is all in what was called Philadelphia County. Gulf Mills was part of Philadelphia County at the time. Where Potter was closer to Philadelphia was also part of Philadelphia County. So I say you have things going on, very confusing events at each end of Philadelphia County. So those 800 men crossed over, but then they looked up high up in the Conshohocken Hills, Rebel Hill, and they saw British soldiers, again, several thousand British soldiers up in the hills. So they weren't sure, well, wait, what are they doing here? They weren't sure what was going on. So what they did was the general ordered them to go back across the Matson's Ford Bridge and essentially take the bridge down as they went and retreat back across to White Marsh on the other side of the Schuylkill. Again, at the same time, General Potter and his men, Colonel Lacey was a Pennsylvania militia officer who really distinguished himself. They're running like crazy, riding their horses like crazy, trying to get away from the British who are coming from the other end. So once they get back across, the 800 troops get back across Matson's Ford, the generals, they all get together, including Washington, to try to figure out what the heck is going on here. Again, is this the entire British Army out to, get us one more time? And now they know, the state that we're in because they had engaged with the army at White Marsh like a week before, no more than 10 days before. But they consulted with Washington and they sent out some scouts to try to see what was going on. And they determined that no, it was not the whole British Army. It was just a large foraging party that was out. So Washington said, look, okay, we're not going to cross at Matson's Ford because that would take us right into the hornet's nest. So we're going to go down the road, a few miles along the riverbank on the White Marsh side. We're going to go down to what is today called Norristown. And there was a crossing there called Swedes Ford. And so Washington said, look, we're going to spend the night here at Swedes Ford. And then in the morning, we're going to cross the Swedes Ford and come into Gulf Mills that way. They determined that, the British that were out, General Cornwallis's forces, just wanted to get some food and supplies to support themselves because, again, they were going into winter quarters in Philadelphia, and there was not a lot of provisions in Philadelphia because you had the 40,000 citizens there, and then you had the British Army. So everybody, and you had blockades. And the river was starting to freeze over. So there was not a lot of food, supply, support in the city. It's said that the British took, that it was a very brutal foraging operation, that the British took 2,000 cattle from the farmers in Gulf Mills and anything else they could get their hands on. And even General Andre wrote in his diary, and General Howe, that it was brutal. It was a brutal foraging operation. Washington and his army were at Swedes Ford, and then the morning of December 12th, they got themselves together and they crossed the Swedes Ford into Gulf Mills. They said they sent maybe a couple hundred down to Matson's Ford to try to cross there because, again, this Swedes Ford was a last minute decision. And what they built at Swedes Ford, the bridge was even more rickety than what they had first built at White Marsh, because that's where they had intended to cross. So anyway, they finally did, early in the morning hours, the 12th to the 13th, crossed into Gulf Mills at the Swedes Ford, most of them. But the Battle of Matson's Ford was a true battle. 20 people lost their lives, and many, I include in the book some of the accounts from the widows who mention the Battle of Matson's Ford or the battle in the Gulf, or their husbands losing their lives or being maimed at the Gulf. And then, some of the soldiers talked about what happened at the Gulf or at the Matson's Ford. And this was a battle that, again, growing up, we didn't know about that. I didn't know about that. And they just, when I found out about it, so what? This happened right here? And so I even asked, many of my classmates, and they're like, I never heard of that. We're lucky that today a lot of these old materials have been digitized. Like, you don't have to go sit actually in someone's archives to gain this knowledge. A lot is online. Thank God that's sharing this information. But living here in Washington, D.C., I was very fortunate, or I am very fortunate that I'm like 4 blocks from the Library of Congress and the manuscript room, and they have original documents from 1770. They have everything in there. I've held in my hand documents from 1777, which I can't believe they let me hold in my hand with no gloves, but they did. It's just kind of amazing. But no one was really looking for this information about what happened at Battle of Matson's Ford. But I included all this information because I want people to understand it was real. It happened. People lost their lives. Well, as you said, Mike, there really has not been a full-length book on the Gulf Mills encampment. People just kind of skipped over it. They felt like, okay, well, Washington was in White Marsh, and he went straight from White Marsh to Valley Forge. Well, that's not true. He was 6 days, 6 or 7 days, depending on, the 11th or the 12th, in Gulf Mills. He was in Gulf Mills, and he didn't know. Well, no one knows exactly when he decided that he was going to go to Valley Forge, but he didn't make that announcement until December 17th, or he announced winter quarters on the 17th. He announced where they were going on the 18th. It just wasn't out here, but I just wanted to make sure that, look, no, they didn't go from White Marsh straight to Valley Forge. And that painting, William Trago's painting, The March to Valley Forge, was from Gulf Mills, not from White Marsh. That was in Gulf Mills. That was where the march to Valley Forge took place. So again, with my research, I wanted to document that this really happened. Okay. So anybody who skips over the Gulf Mills encampment, you're wrong. You haven't done all of your research. I have 400 footnotes in my book and at least 10 pages of bibliography, because again, I'm not a PhD historian. I'm a history buff, journalist, historian. And I knew I had to document everything or I would be challenged. So that's what I did in my book.
I guess Gulf Mills provided a good temporary position for the army because it was on the high ground and put the river between them and the enemy. It kind of gave Washington a few days to consider his options and decide really what he was going to do next. Now, you say Washington didn't announce that he was going to go to Valley Forge right away. But I get the impression from the book that he didn't know what he was going to do, and that he
Yes.
ended up spending a lot of time consulting with his generals. Should they go into winter quarters? Should they re-engage with the British one last time, or just continue to re-engage with them? If they were going to go into winter quarters, where should they go? They really had to decide all these questions, right?
They did. Washington, when they were still in White Marsh, he solicited all of his generals as to whether they should engage in battle with the British one more time. And almost all of them said, no, we're not prepared. We don't have well, the men are tired. They don't have the clothes. They don't have the food. We're just not ready. No, we shouldn't do that. Now, that was before White Marsh when they had to fight them anyway, but not to the degree that they thought they were going to have to. And he also solicited all of his generals as to where they should go for winter quarters. So he got opinions from all the generals, which I have in the book, as to where they should go. And he gave them some options, like should it be somewhere around Philadelphia so that we can get, if we had to get to engage with the British or we had to get to Philadelphia, we could do that within a day. Or should we go to Wilmington or maybe the Jersey somewhere, or even Maryland? So he gave them some options, or Lancaster up the Lancaster and York area, up where the Continental Congress and the Pennsylvania General Assembly were. So all the generals weighed in on where they felt winter quarters should be and why they felt it should be in whatever location that they had selected. A few of them said it should be somewhere in the Philadelphia area. They called it like Tredyffrin Township, which was really the township. Well, part of Valley Forge is in Tredyffrin Township. Easttown Township, part is in Upper Marion Township. So a few of the generals said, yes, it should be here, but others were like, no, it should be in these other locations. So you're right, Michael, he didn't know. And I have documents from some of the generals saying, as late as, let's see, December 15th, 16th, they don't know where they're going. They just know that they're going into winter quarters, but they don't know where they're going. Now, it could be that Washington just had made the decision already. He just kept it to himself because there were spies everywhere, or he actually didn't know, because people are like, especially people who know the area, are like, well, if he really wanted to go to Valley Forge, when he came over the Swedes Ford, he just could have kept going straight down the road that led to Valley Forge. And the Swedes Ford Road leads straight into Valley Forge. So why would he have to take a detour and come to Gulf Mills, where there was like basically nothing there for him, if he had already made the decision to go to Valley Forge? So that's in Washington's decision. Now, he announced on December 17th that, well, he had made the decision that they were going into winter quarters. And he told the soldiers in his general orders that he was going to delay the march. He said it was a place about 7 or 8 miles from where they were in Gulf Mills. And that's about the distance that Valley Forge is from Gulf Mills. But he never said Valley Forge. And he said, we're just going to delay the march for a day because on the 18th, the United States, the Continental Congress, had decided that that would be a national day of Thanksgiving. Everybody wanted to celebrate Horatio Gates' victory in Saratoga, but the Continental Congress wanted to establish a national holiday when all the colonies and colonists or new citizens would be celebrating that. So they passed a resolution in November 1777 that this day of Thanksgiving would be December 18th. So Washington told his soldiers that we're going to stop right here. We're going to celebrate the day of Thanksgiving on the 18th, and then we're going to move out on the 19th. So nobody knows, again, exactly when he made the decision, and anybody who says they do is wrong.
Yeah, and it could be somewhere in between. Like he had a thought that we'll probably do this, but he was keeping his options open, and who knows what. I mean, you have to remember, the Americans still held forts on the Delaware River at this time. They had the potential of starving out the British if they could keep the British Navy from reaching Philadelphia. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of consideration given to moving down to Wilmington, Delaware, and supporting those forts and making sure that the Navy could not get up the river to Philadelphia. But of course, by doing that, they opened up a hold that would allow the British to simply march out to Lancaster and York and take out the civilian government. So yeah, there were a lot of different considerations in what
Right.
we're doing here. And I think that the high ground at Gulf Mills gave him, a point to stop and breathe because, you say he could have just gone from Matson's Ford and kept marching down the road to Valley Forge. But the big fear,
Bridgeport.
I'm sorry, Swedes Ford to Valley
Yeah.
Forge. The big fear, though, was that he would be caught, on the march by the British Army. He was able to dissuade the British from attacking at White Marsh because he had very good defensive positions and he was all ready to go. If his men were marching in a column and they got hit by the entire British Army, that would have been a disaster. So Gulf Mills gave him an opportunity to stop, think, see what the British were doing, figure out whether they were going to do anything more offensive before he took that march to Valley Forge.
Right, because Gulf Mills was the high ground. I mean, like if you were on top of Rebel Hill at the time, it was like the highest hill in the area, 400 feet. And you could see to Philadelphia, like from the top of Rebel Hill at
Right.
the end, it's closest to the Schuylkill. You could see over there. So, right, it was very strategic for Washington because he could see if the British decided they were going to come out again. Now they knew where they were. The Continental Army could see them coming towards them when they were in Gulf Mills, correct?
So yeah, it was a good place where he could keep an eye on the enemy and consider how he was going to make his transfer into winter quarters.
Right.
You do paint a good picture in your book, I think, about, as you say, you quote a lot of people, everyday figures who were in there. What was his name? Dr. Albigence Waldo.
Oh, yes, Dr. Walden. Yes.
I found it interesting. I guess he was a medical officer from the Connecticut line.
Yeah.
Talked a lot about the hunger and lack of clothing and all that, which we know full well was a serious problem at Valley Forge and obviously before that as well. He also talked about, I wrote the quote down, a spirit of alacrity and contentment or even cheerfulness among the men. That kind of surprised me because I always kind of got the feeling that after this disastrous Philadelphia campaign and into the misery and deprivation of Valley Forge, that morale must have been kind of low.
Well, one of the people asked me, well, what's the what's like one thing that you really take away from your research and your writing? And what really got me is the extreme personal sacrifice that these soldiers made to fight this war. So, with what Dr. Waldo saying, who went on to become like the first Surgeon General for the Continental Army, what he's saying is that despite all of the hardships, and like you said, Michael, I looked at a lot of journals of soldiers, I looked at their orderly books, correspondence. So I put a lot of that in the book. Um, and and they did really suffer. They didn't have food, they didn't have clothes, they were away from their families, they didn't have shoes, people were getting sick left and right.
Yeah, no shoes and clothes. And remember, this is December and it's cold.
In December. But despite all of that, they believed in their cause. And they believed that they had a personal duty to fight this cause. Like, who else was going to do it? They felt like they wanted a different type of life. They wanted a different type of country. They didn't want a king. They wanted a republic. They wanted a democracy, and they were willing to sacrifice. And and their families went along with them. Now, maybe not always, but they had their family sacrifice a lot too. So, in reading their diaries and reading these early books, their letters, it's these people made extreme personal sacrifices. So that led me to ask myself, what would I do for democracy? Because I know what they did. So I asked myself that question. And then I said, well, that's what I'm going to ask people when I speak. Like, what would you do for democracy? Just keep that in your head. Like, what would you do if you were called on to create a democracy? A lot of things going on today, save democracy, defend democracy. What would you do for democracy? Because they sure gave a lot of sacrifices.
Oh, absolutely. And you hear a lot of quotes from the founding fathers after the war noting that, the fight for democracy is a constant struggle against the forces of tyranny. And you can't just sit back and enjoy what your ancestors, your fathers did. It's a continual fight against the forces that want to undermine democracy and take us back to a time where a small group can control us without our say, essentially.
Exactly. I mean, the themes of e pluribus unum, out of many one. I mean, that was kind of one of the things they were fighting for. That was a guiding principle. And another one, that was reflected in our Constitution was, well, in order to form a more perfect union. That was in their heads. Like the government is figuring, what are we going to do here? How are we putting this together? I talk about the Continental Congress in November. They finally passed the Articles of Confederation that would give the soldiers a government that they were fighting for. And so they sent it out to the states to consider. Every state had to adopt the articles. And the first state that adopted it was Virginia, and they adopted it during the Gulf Mills encampment, December 15th and 16th were the days it was finally adopted. And then the other states followed suit. It took a while, but they followed suit. So
Maryland 4 years, but okay.
yeah. So these were the things that were in, I think, all of their minds. Like, we're going to make this happen, and we just have to sacrifice to make it happen, because they did not like the current situation. They didn't like living under a king. They didn't like not having a say in formulating their own lives.
No, I think you're right that a great many Continental soldiers, including the enlisted men, were very self-motivated, ideologically motivated. They weren't just there because they had to be.
Right.
Sure, there were some, but a great many of them really believed in the cause they were fighting for. And if you read some of Thomas Paine's stuff at this time, it's really, I think, hammers this stuff home for you. I mean, he basically says that even if life wasn't completely miserable under the king, it was putting in place an unfair system that would inevitably make it miserable, maybe not for our generation, but for our children or our children's children, and that we have to fight to make sure that the system we have in place that governs us is fair, or this inevitable creep toward tyranny is just going to get consistently worse. And I think that was an ideology for a lot of people. They were fighting not only for themselves, but for their children and their children's children to help establish this system, which is free and fair for all.
Mm-hmm.
So
Correct.
I think that was a big part of it. And you're right. The men did go through a huge amount of deprivation and kept their morale up. Now we'll see after 3 or 4 years of this more, the morale dips a little bit. We start seeing some mutinies and stuff because it does get pretty miserable. But yeah, certainly the men were ideologically motivated, especially at this time in 1777.
Right.
And so as you say, Washington eventually decides on Valley Forge for winter quarters. A lot of that is because of its location. It sits between Lancaster and Philadelphia, so they kind of protect the the Pennsylvania government and the Continental Congress.
Right.
The land they choose itself is heavily wooded and has several streams running through it, so they have a source of wood and water, which they're definitely going to need if they're going to build a winter encampment. And they don't want to build it in any particular town, an established town, because the army would just overwhelm those people and make it an absolute misery for them. I think that's why Valley Forge ultimately became the place to go.
Yeah. Although there were people living, there, farmer, but it wasn't a city, really.
Well, yeah, a few farmers as opposed to a city of hundreds of thousands. So Gulf Mills essentially serves as this way station, as a decision point to get from engagement with the British at Philadelphia to a place where they could take a step back and get through the winter and prepare for the next year's fighting season.
Exactly. And then, my last chapter in the book is the role of Gulf Mills during the Valley Forge encampment, because again, it was such a strategic location. Like when Washington marched to Valley Forge, he didn't just leave, like everybody just left Gulf Mills. That wasn't true. He left, well, at the time, he left General Sterling there for a few weeks before General Sterling even went to Valley Forge. And then during the encampment, he did have a picket post there right on Gulf Road, down the road from the Hanging Rock, the building still exists. It's a restaurant. It's called Savona now. It used to be called the Picket Post. there was, all during the Valley Forge encampment, a picket there. Aaron Burr was one of the officers in command of the picket during the Valley Forge encampment, and he did have a mutiny, which he put down from his soldiers. But it was very strategic. And during the Battle of Barron Hill, when General Lafayette went back to White Marsh, when the British, thought they could come out one more time and capture him, no. But he retreated back to Rebel Hill, back to Gulf Mills. And people say Washington was at the top of Rebel Hill because of his close relationship with Lafayette, like ready to call out the entire Continental Army if needed to support this British incursion against Lafayette and the Oneida Indians over there in Lafayette. Well, now it's called Lafayette Hills, but White Marsh. So, so it was a very important location. I include, again, a lot of documents. I include strength returns that show they were there during the encampment. And I just have to say, nobody has a strength return from December. Nobody that I know has found a strength return from December 15th, the Gulf Mills encampment, except me. I have one in the book from General Barnum's division. And when I found that at the Library of Congress, I basically screamed because this is like real proof. It says at the top, December 15th, Gulf Mills. And then he lists the soldiers fit for duty, those who were sick, etc., present. And then at the bottom of the page, it's December 22nd. Valley Forge. So that's the only one I've ever seen. I looked everywhere from the Gulf Mills encampment, but I don't know. I may just go look at every single officer's papers and see if I can find some of the others, because they're not at the Library of Congress. Generally, they're not in Fold 3. They're not in the National Archives. But I'm going to keep looking. And I have an order of march to Valley Forge. Like, I've never seen that before. That says Order of March to Valley Forge. And I found that in someone's orderly book. And I list that picture in the book. And again, so many researchers overlook the Gulf Mills encampment, and never, I don't think, ever really looked for these documents.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Well, I found it very enlightening.
Thank you. You can always email me too.
I guess Gulf Mills remained an important point because, as you say, it was the high ground. They could keep an eye on Philadelphia, and there was a lot of conflicts between foraging parties, right, all winter long, coming out from Philadelphia.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. All winter long, and all along the edges. Yes, there were conflicts, particularly across the Schuylkill. On the other side of Schuylkill, in that White Marsh area. So there were a lot of conflicts. Yes, and Gulf Mills is right on the road. Like, if you're coming across the Schuylkill, and basically, if you're going to go to Philadelphia, if you're crossing the Matson's Ford and you're going to go to Valley Forge, you basically got to go through Gulf Mills. So again, it's the high ground. They could see what's going on. They could even see the Swedes Ford. If they were coming across the Swedes Ford at modern day Norristown, they could still see the British coming across there and go and warn the Continental Army at Valley Forge. So it was very strategic location.
Were they the two major fords across the river? And was there anything in between, like that was possible to, like, at certain times of the year it was possible to pass over?
Yes, there was another ford called Blevins Ford, which I think, like you're saying, was a smaller ford. And maybe was not always as visible or easy to cross as Matson's Ford and Swedes Ford. And I think at some point it did disappear. Matson's Ford, yes.
I was wondering, you mentioned you found complete paperwork for the Army at Gulf Ford?
Just for General Barnum's division, Rhode Island.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just for his division. I was just curious what the present for duty was.
Oh, well,
Do you have that memorized?
No, I don't. Book.
That's why you have to get the book.
Yeah.
I know.
Thank you, Michael.
I'll
I
check
look forward to getting your book.
Thank you.
All right, well, we're hitting the top of the hour. Again, the book's name is Threshold to Valley Forge. It's available wherever fine books are sold. I will certainly put a link in the show notes for anybody who's listening to this as a recording. yeah, it's definitely worth reading. It fills an interesting hole in our known history about the Revolutionary War. And I really want to thank Sheilah Vance for joining us tonight to discuss it.
Thank you for having me, Michael, and to the whole roundtable. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. One thing I just want to mention for anybody who's in the Philadelphia area, I know this used to be a South Jersey roundtable. The Ken Burns American Revolution special is coming out in November. Prior to that, he's kind of doing a national tour and hitting a lot of the big cities to do live events. I think he's doing one in DC as well. You can get free tickets for the event. You can see a preview of, I'm guessing, an episode from the Revolution, and then I guess Ken Burns is going to answer questions or give a talk or something. So it should be an interesting event. I'm going to the one in Camden, New Jersey next month, and I invite everybody else to sign up for one near them as well. I think that should be a really interesting event. But other than that, I guess we'll see everyone at the roundtable next month. Appreciate you coming out for this one.
Thank you, everyone.
Once again, I'd like to thank Sheilah Vance, author of Threshold to Valley Forge, The 6 Days of the Gulf Mills Encampment, for joining our roundtable this month. And thanks to everyone else who chose to join our roundtable discussion live on Zoom. If you would like to join our roundtables live, please be sure to add your email address to my mailing list or join as a subscriber on Patreon. You can subscribe for free on Patreon, and you will receive advance notifications of these live events. The events themselves are also free. I've included a link to buy this book, which, by the way, is on a big sale on Amazon right now. I have also included links for my mailing list and Patreon page at the bottom of the show notes for this episode, which you can find at blog.amrevpodcast.com. Once again, thanks for listening, and I hope you will join us again next week for another American Revolution podcast.